Hello, my name is Chris Phelan. I'm chair of the Department of Economics, and just on behalf of the department, I want to simply welcome you. Today's topic, early childhood education, could not be more important or more vital for the future of the country. And I don't want to take up any more time than necessary, so I want to introduce our moderator, Sojourner, who's a assistant professor in the Carlson School of Management, who will be moderating and will tell us what the rules are.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So we're in for a real treat tonight, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with these two accomplished panelists who've led the way forward on human capital research and policy. We have Dr. Art Rolnick, who's done pioneering research on measuring the payoffs from early childhood investment and developed a lot of innovative new models for policy that helps create human capital efficiently, early learning scholarships, quality rating systems that have made a real impact and are rolling out in Minnesota and being developed elsewhere around the country. And we have Libby Doggett. Dr. Libby Doggett has had a spectacular career focused on expanding and developing the best policy for promoting early learning opportunities for our nation's families, from Head Start to home visiting programs, PreK. She's worked in all of these areas, and for the last year, she's served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Learning Opportunities at the U.S. Department of Education, where she's basically led our nation's efforts in this direction, and we're delighted to have her here in Minneapolis and Minnesota with us. And we're honored by your presence here tonight, too. A large group of such caring and curious people who would spend an evening thinking about economic policy and research. Give yourselves a hand, or at least your neighbors. Our nation is missing out. We are leaving money on the table. Too much of our human potential goes unrealized. Too many kids are growing up learning how to survive, but not learning how to thrive. And it really doesn't have to be this way. We've now assembled overwhelming evidence that early learning matters. People on the stage have developed evidence, people around the U at the Human Capital Research Collaborative, the Institute for Child Development, and elsewhere, and all around the country, the evidence just keeps coming in that these kinds of early learning opportunities, investing very young, really has outsized returns. And without further ado, I'm going to tell you the ground rules for tonight. So we're going to have about 15 minutes for each panelist. Art will tell us about his perspective on the economic research, especially the policy trajectory in Minnesota. Dr. Doggett will tell us her perspective, 15 minutes on national policy developments and exciting initiatives going on in states and communities all around the country. And we're going to preserve a lot of time for questions from the audience, answers from the panelists. When we get to that part, please ask your questions directly, concisely, clearly. Make sure we have time for everyone else to ask their question. I'm going to try to enforce that. No lengthy preambles. So without further ado, Dr. Rolnick.
Thank you, Aaron. My assignment by the Heller-Hurwicz Institute was to talk about what I'll call the Minnesota model, the Minnesota approach to early childhood education that's developed over the last 10 years. And as I look out, I wanted Libby to know that many out there have been involved in making this happen and making this successful. So in a way, I'm talking for them. And this model is in, and I'm very honored to be here because Leo Hurwicz and Walter Heller were mentors of mine. And the one thing you learn about, one of the many, actually you learn many things here in the economics world and at the University of Minnesota is that good research and good policy go hand in hand. So I'm going to start by talking about the research, and I want to argue the research, as Aaron sort of mentioned, is overwhelming, that investing in high-quality research for our most vulnerable kids are the best public investment we can make. And I'm going to go through the research to briefly to kind of, this audience I know I don't have to convince, but just trying to review it. And then I'm going to turn to Minnesota's stab at it, if you will. This is the business community in the name of, named the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. And this was a private nonprofit that raised $20 million to take, if you will, the ivory tower research and see if it would work in the real world. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of MELF and what it did. I thought pretty naively, you got all this research, now we have this pilot that we did showing these great results. You know, it would happen. I think of the analogy in playing cards where if you play poker, you know, cards read, right? I mean, you put your cards on the table, whoever's got the highest hand wins. Doesn't work that way in the political system, I learned. And so the last thing I want to mention is an organization that was created by many of the nonprofits world here in Minnesota. It's called MiniMinds, and they deserve an awful lot of credit for lobbying. I mean lobbying hard for early childhood education scholarships and mentors. And so I'll conclude with where we're going with that and our ultimate goal. Okay, so the research. I started out, you know, I tell people my expertise was pre-Civil War banking. But I was told to start looking at the longitudinal research, and there's three very famous studies on if you provide children, vulnerable children, with high-quality early childhood education at these foundation years, the longitudinal research shows you can make a huge difference. The famous one is PreK preschool. When Rob Grunwald and I had the data and asked a very simple question with the outcomes, what was the return on the investment? This is what most business people and economists would ask. And backing out, we knew what the costs were, we knew what the benefits were, we could back out the annual rate of return on that investment. We got an 18% inflation-adjusted return. I was actually a little bit worried with that analysis. We sent all this data to James Heckman, Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago, say, Jim, this looks way too high. Would you check it? He came back with the exact same number. And in fact, since then, we've argued we've underestimated the return because we didn't have data on health statistics. We didn't have data on the siblings in the family. We didn't have data on children of the children. We didn't have data on teacher productivity, and on and on. So as high as that number is, we claimed 10 years ago, this is the best public investment you can make, and no one has challenged it since. The other studies I want to mention, one in particular, there's the Abecedarian study, which started at birth, and again, long-term, very high returns, and child-parent center studies. My colleagues at HCRC, Judy Temple and Arthur Reynolds, are famous for this work. That was age 3 to grade 3, making sure that there's quality K-3 programs so that there's no fade-out, and they get from that study very, very strong returns. So those are 3 independent studies that come to the same conclusion. But there's another totally different line of research that leads you in the same direction, and that's Heckman told me I should talk to this guy, Jack Shunkoff. He was the author of the book From Neurons to Neighborhoods, all about brain development. And sure enough, what the neuroscientists are finding, how critical the brain development is from the very beginning. Something like 80 to 90% of the brain is developed by age 3 or 4. And if children are in stressful environments, and I want you to equate stress with poverty, their brain doesn't develop properly. In fact, by age 3, you've got problems. So that was the research. I was very fortunate. A man by the name of Warren Staley, who was CEO of the Cargill company, said, okay, Rolnick, that sounds good in theory. Let's see if we can put it in practice. And Warren Staley created what is now known as the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation, a nonprofit that we put together 5 years. We were going to sunset. We were going to do this really well and then turn it over to the powers to be. And we had some incredible people on this board. Friends of Warren included Doug Baker from Ecolab. I see Julie is here. Ken Powell from General Mills. Bob Brunix was on this board. Mike Cerisi, Gene Taylor from the Taylor Corporation. Charlie Weaver, who was governor Palenti's chief of staff, who is now the executive director of business partnership. So we had a business focus, and they bought into our ideas. This is what Grunwald and Rolnick suggested. How do you bring this theory into practice? A couple of economists, we call it a business-based approach. A market-based approach, fairly straightforward, scholarships. Scholarships not to send your child to the University of Minnesota, to Harvard, but scholarships for our vulnerable children so they can go to high-quality early childhood education programs. So Minnesota Early Learning Foundation raised $20 million. Half of it went to create a rating system. This doesn't work if you don't have quality, okay? So our scholarships have to be used at it's a 4-star rating system. We said 3 or 4-star rated program. And then we circled a neighborhood in St. Paul, vulnerable neighborhood, low-income families, and we just first come, first serve. We ran out of money fairly quickly. 650 families received these scholarships, brought in an outside evaluator. I can tell you, the outside evaluator, the results were very strong. These kids were doing significantly better than their peers, if you will, in low-income areas, and very close to the majority kids. Okay, so we have this pilot. It was $20 million, privately funded. We're getting the results based on really good research. We argued, by the way, our scholarships are really scholarship plus. When we could, we started our parents' prenatal with a home visiting nurse. That's another significant research that shows that earlier the better. And we started to say, well, okay, let's bring it to the state. Like I said, I thought cards would read. That doesn't happen this way. Mall of America, for example, got $250 million, and we're still struggling, and they don't have this research. So I realized you've got to figure out a way to market this research. These kids are invisible. These problems are long-term. These parents don't vote. So a number of nonprofits got together, led by Twin Cities United Way and Minneapolis Foundation, and all the very prominent nonprofits got together, and they created what is known as Minnesota Minds, MiniMinds, with the idea that we were going to make this as visible as we possibly could and literally go out and lobby for these kids. Now, fortunately, and I have to give Rahm Emanuel a lot of credit for this, Rahm Emanuel, knowing about the work that we did here, put in $500 million in Race to the Top for states to bid if they have innovative early ed programs. In Race to the Top, we got $45 million to replicate what we did in St. Paul in 3 other transformational communities, which includes north side of Minneapolis, it includes White Earth, and a rural area out in Itasca County. So that was the Race to the Top money, and then the state, with the help of MiniMinds, lobbying heavily in the previous session, we got $40 million for additional scholarships. And in this last so-called non-session, when it's very hard to get any funding, we got another $4.6 million. Sounds very good, and it is. It's a big step for Minnesota. We now serve however, we're only serving about 10% of our children. So ultimately, what MiniMinds plans on doing is lobbying that we fully fund this. And let me just conclude with how we're going to finance that. It's an idea that came about a number of years ago, is to create an endowed fund, so it's permanent. And when it's permanent, we have a much better chance of getting the market to respond and continue building infrastructure. And this endowed fund, we already have an endowed fund. It's called the School Land Trust Fund. We want to take that fund and earmark it for early childhood education, get some matching money from the federal government, from private, to get it up to $1.5 billion. If we get it up to $1.5 billion, we can fund early learning scholarships plus mentors starting prenatal for every child born in poverty in the state in perpetuity. So we've got the research. We've got the pilot to show that we can do this. We now have the beginnings of a lobbying effort that says this is probably the best investment we can make in the state, and now is the time to do it. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but now is the time to start to do it. So I wanted Libby to know how much success we're having here and what we plan on doing. And ultimately, we want to market, and we are marketing these ideas in other states around the country. But again, we think it takes good research to do good policy. That's exactly what Heller-Hurwicz and Walter Heller were about. That's what this institute is about. And I'm glad you're here to hear that story.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Aaron, for that nice introduction. And I just want to say something about our work. It is revolutionary. When he entered the field and started talking about the economics of this, it changed the dialogue. Not just in Minnesota, but really, I think it probably actually had more effect across the country than even in Minnesota. And his work is still driving policy. It's not just research, it's the research and the policy and the politics. And you got to get all three of them right. And of course, early learning is a great way to do that. I'd also like to recognize all the great leaders in early learning here in this room. I appreciate what you all do day in, day out, because it's what occurs between that teacher and that child that is really magical. And there are people in this room that have been doing that kind of work and leading it for a long time. So hats off to you, and thank you all for coming. What a great time to be working in early learning. I've been doing this all my life, but there has been no more exciting time than today, right now, in our country, and even across the world. It's interesting because it is work like the work that Art has led that has made a real difference in the United States. You know, from Seattle to San Antonio to New York, lots of cities, and then from states like Alabama to California to Maine, we see elected officials that are doing just what Art has asked Minnesota to do, which are stepping up, putting the dollars behind early learning systems, and doing it in a very public way. We're fortunate because President Barack Obama and lawmakers and local officials from both sides of the aisle are really stepping up. I'm delighted to work for Arne Duncan, and he recently made a speech to the National Governors Association, and I love the title of his speech. I won't give his speech, but I'll tell you the title. It was the top 10 list for why expansion of high-quality early learning is inevitable, and it's going to happen. Even though I'm very optimistic, I do want to say that the need is great. I know the need in Minnesota is great. Art touched on that. We just recently released some civil rights data, and it revealed great opportunity gaps, because this is really an opportunity gap. It's not that these kids can't learn, it's that they don't have the opportunity to learn. So it's an opportunity gap. It starts before children even enter kindergarten. Nationwide, 40%, almost 7,000 districts don't have public preschool programs. It also showed that thousands of preschool children are suspended or expelled from preschool. We just got to do better. So I'm not going to talk about the research or the return on investment, because Art has really already done that, and that's his area of expertise. And what I really want to do is talk about what's happening. So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening nationally, and then what's happening at the state level, and then what's happening in cities. And what I want you to think about, because the question is not does this work, but the question is how do we pay for it? And Art didn't touch on this, but it's really important to have quality, because if you don't have quality programs, you don't get the return on investment. So how do we scale up and have quality, and then how do we pay for it? So nationally, polling is showing that everybody really supports early learning. It didn't used to be the case. In fact, 10 years ago we did a poll, and my pollster said, you have a lot of work to do, Libby. So we've done a lot of work and have really changed that, so that people on both sides of the aisle, and men and women, all support early learning. They know the importance of that brain development, and they're actually willing to put the money in to pay for it. We're excited that Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge money, and it's $1 billion. It's going out to 20 states. I'm happy that Minnesota is one of the states that is benefiting from that. That money is going to build the systems, because we have Head Start, child care, and school-based preschool, and it's got to be pulled together. Art mentioned the quality rating systems. I think Minnesota is very far ahead in that. But listen to this. In 2009, only 17 states operated a quality rating system for early learning programs. Today, more than 35 states, more than double the number 5 years ago, have fully implemented all the quality pieces of a quality rating system that we think are important. And every state except one is working on that. A few years ago, early learning field was fighting any assessments. people in early learning said, "Ooh, I don't really know if we want you to assess these kids." I kept saying, assessments are our friend. We got to know where these kids are. Today, because of the Early Learning Challenge Fund, we have 29 states developing kindergarten entry assessments that will give us as policy leaders a good view of how kids are doing when they get to kindergarten, but also it gives that kindergarten teacher a really good basis for teaching. He or she will know what kids know, and they'll start, and hopefully they won't underteach them, they'll challenge them, because I think kindergarten we could do better. Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge is also building great systems for reaching out to parents. A number of states are getting parents who didn't ever go to a library. I had a parent tell me they didn't even know the library card was free, and so now they're to be able to take their children to the library, get free books and resources there. But President Obama wants to do much more. The Early Learning Challenge is great. It's $1 billion. It's building those systems. But we don't want a Cadillac system without any good programs. So we still need money to go into those programs, the home visiting programs that Art mentioned, as well as the preschool programs. The President has a Birth to 5 agenda that will maintain and build on our current Head Start investments. It'll support a greater share of infants and toddlers and 3-year-olds getting into Head Start. It'll provide money to greatly expand home visiting. And the main piece is $75 billion over 10 years to provide quality pre-K for every 4-year-old in this country at 200% of poverty or below. Under the President's proposal, Minnesota would receive an estimated $38,700,000 in the first year alone if it participated in this plan. That would serve 4,000 with some state match. That would serve 4,700 children in the first year. That proposal has now been turned into a piece of legislation that has been introduced by Senator Harkin and by Congressman Miller and Hanna, a bipartisan group. In the Senate, they've had a hearing on it. We're still waiting for action in both houses. But it is a bill, and that's pretty exciting. We're delighted to also have a down payment on the President's proposal of $250 million in preschool development grants. That funding, those of you in early childhood know, are waiting for us to come out with a proposal sometime this summer. It will go out in 2 different pieces. One will go to states that haven't done a lot around early learning, and that's not Minnesota. And the other will go out to states like Minnesota that have a Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant or are serving more than 10% of their children. Actually, Minnesota would fall in the former category because you're not serving 10% of your 4-year-olds yet. But because you have an Early Learning Challenge Fund, you will go into that second set. We hope that will go, the notice will go out sometime this summer. The states will have a couple of months to work on it. Because it's just a down payment on the President's bigger proposal, the money will go out to the state, but the state will have to select a few communities. They won't be able to serve the whole state. And so we'll serve a couple of communities to bring model programs to scale. So it's pretty exciting what's happening at the federal level, but truthfully, the real action is there at the state level. Nationwide, enrollment on preschool has really exploded over the past decade. From 2001 to 2002 school year to 2011-12, so it was about 10 years, enrollment of state-funded preschool increased from 14% to 28%. While it declined slightly in 2013, we've seen an uptick in 2014, which is great. You know that we're really in a political sea change when you hear a governor like Governor Snyder in Michigan, who declared in his State of the State speech that he wanted to make sure Michigan is a no-wait state for early childhood education. This is certainly, I think, a parade that I want to get in front of. Last year, we had 30 governors, 17 Republicans, 13 Democrats, increased funding for preschool in their state budgets. 10 states increased more than 20%. And this year, as legislative sessions are ending, we're seeing some of the same great increases. So in New York, we had the mayor and the governor fighting over who should pay for pre-K. That really helps. So they ended up with $300 million going into preschool across that state. In Maine, just most recently, they passed a legislation to fund pre-K for every 4-year-old by the year 2016. And in Utah, we have a very interesting model. This is in Salt Lake City, mainly in the Granite School Districts. Goldman Sachs and a private investor are working with the United Way in Salt Lake to fund expansion of preschool through social impact bonds. So the private sector is putting up the money, and they're betting that the savings in special education will actually help pay for their investment. And they're on target and thinking that they want to expand to other districts. Before I end, I just want to take the quick look at what cities are doing. So states can't wait for the federal government to act, and that's good. I'm glad they're moving ahead. But cities can't wait for states to act. So we have we have mayors all over the country who are coming to my office and saying, hey, we want to do more and want to know where good things are happening. Look at Boston. They've had pre-K for every 4-year-old. It's a high-quality program. Tulsa, San Francisco are really leading the way. We're delighted that in our state of Texas, we have the mayor, Julian Castro, who's got the city to put in an 1/8 of a cent sales tax to fund pre-K for 4-year-olds in that city. And recently, Seattle, with the great work of the mayor and the city council, has passed a tax increase. So they're going to fund pre-K for every 3- and 4-year-old at 200% of poverty. And then parents over that will have to pay a slight fee based on a sliding scale. So when you're thinking about pre-K, you can see there are lots of ways to pay for this. The most exciting one, I think, is in, well, you're doing an exciting one. I'd say one of the easier ones is in West Virginia. About 10 years ago, West Virginia said, we want pre-K for every 4-year-old in our state. Districts have 10 years to put it in place. It's paid for through the school funding formula. And 50% of those services need to be provided out in child care and Head Start. They've done it. Every 4-year-old in West Virginia has access to pre-K. And the other state to look at, in terms of access, but also really in terms of quality, is New Jersey. By court order, they were asked to put in place pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds in certain districts. They had nothing going on. They didn't even have a certificate. And over 5 years, they put in place the certification for the teachers, the programs in schools and in the community, the funding, and the continuous quality improvement, so that now New Jersey has one of the best programs in the country. So with that, I'll end, and we look forward to your questions, and I hope we can talk a little bit about quality and how to pay for it.
Thank you. All right, so now it's your turn to ask questions. And there's 2 folks with mics, and so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll ask them to come forward and give you the mic. And so 1, 2 back there, or, well, why don't we go one back there, and 2 here, coming down. I guess while we're getting started, though, I'm going to ask one question. As an economist, the first question that comes to my mind when somebody says, I've got this great investment, the returns are so high, it seems too good to be true. I ask myself, why are the returns so high? You know, what is the market failure? What factors are militating against resources being allocated here efficiently? What's going on? So
there's 2 parts to the answer to that. One is when I talk about an 18% return, most of that is public. And as economists, we teach that while the private sector, go back to Adam Smith, does a great job in allocating resources for private goods and services, when it comes to public goods that we all benefit from, but are difficult to charge for, et cetera, the market generally fails with public goods. So things like reducing crime and reducing welfare and having better citizens Those are the kind of public goods that the market's going to fail on. And the big market failure here is you don't get to choose your parents. There's no market for you. If you're born into poverty, you're born into poverty. That's it. There is no market for parents. So you could think of what
babies can't borrow.
Babies can't borrow. You could think of what we're trying to do. And actually, there was a man by the name of Russ Whitehurst, who was Laura Bush's chief education advisor years ago, gave me this language. Essentially, what we're proposing here in Minnesota is giving tools to parents, to empower those parents, tools that they can use in the market to get a better outcome. There's market failures here, and I think it's pretty obvious when you think about it. Again, the publicness of much of the return that we're talking about, and the fact that there is no market for parents.
Thanks.
Art, when you
Jim?
talked about the... Hi, Art.
Hi, Jim.
If it's too loud here. Art started talking about the Minnesota model. And the Minnesota model clearly was a market-based model. And so, I'm very curious about whether the federal government, how much federal government is trying to get the market involved and the states involved. Because, I sit up here and I hear all this funding, that funding, this funding, that funding. Well, my kids go to Minneapolis public schools, and they are funded very well. But I think, there's a lot of failure in schools that are funded well. So, again, the funding, I think the market is a key part, and I'm just wondering to what extent that's being brought up throughout this discussion.
Well, it's a really good question, and I might let Art talk a little bit about it as well. I think I'm at the Department of Education, so we're looking at this more as a piece of education, and it's a foundational piece of education that will make the whole system work better. Art's coming at it from a different perspective as an economist, and clearly, what's exciting is that it works as a foundational piece for education because it does make education work better, but it also works for the economics of it because if a school puts it in place, then they can save money in special education like they're doing out in the Granite School District. So I think, we're certainly looking at it and want to help states do what they're doing. I think Arnie Duncan's approach is really a lot of great stuff is happening in the states, and what we want to do is we want to be partners in that and help find some funding for it and some support for it, and then get out of the way.
Jim, as you may know, there's a lot of angst about a market-based approach, and I think it's up to us to show how well it works here. And when talking with Secretary Duncan, to his credit, he said they're going to take a neutral approach to this. They're going to look at different states and how they do it, and see who gets the bottom line, the best results. Now, the fact that we're starting as early as prenatal, that we're starting empowering the parents, and the parents have critical. If we're going to get these long-term results, we have to have that parent engagement. And we're going to argue this approach, the market-based approach, which, by the way, does develop quality, because our scholarships have to be used at quality programs, and we're providing lots of incentives, and it's happening. Our Parent Aware for School Readiness, that's an organization that came out of MELF. We oversee this rating system, and what we're documenting is over the last number of years with all the scholarship money coming, many programs now are increasing their quality because they want those scholarship money. So we're affecting quality all through the state, not just for our most vulnerable kids. And as economists, we, of course, think there's a lot of power to the market, and it can help us get these kind of results. But I do think it's incumbent upon us to kind of show that it's working, and one of the reasons I think highly of what MELF did is we showed that in St. Paul. The critics told us there's no quality programs in St. Paul. This isn't going to work. Well, as soon as the market found out there were 650 families with scholarships paying up to $13,000 a year, Montessori expanded their program. New Horizons opened up a brand new facility right in Frogtown. That's real economic development. So we're going to document this for Washington and show that this is an approach that at least you should consider as one of the better approaches to this. And it's based, again, on all this research that says the earlier you start, the better. So my problems with what's going on in New York, and I'm actually talking to some of the people in New York, if you do Universal 4, I mean, it's a good first start, but many of those kids you don't have to worry about. They're middle-class kids. They're not the ones ending in jail. But you're missing those prenatal to 3 years. And you got a market out there that can deliver this. And so I'm hoping they're going to take some of that funding and at least partially do a market-based approach.
Thanks.
A couple quick questions. Pre-K, is it a 12-month or 9-month program?
Well, it's whatever the state wants to put in place.
What are you finding that they're doing?
I think, well, it depends. I mean, I think states actually have a variety. But in a state like Texas, we offer pre-K for all at-risk 4-year-olds, but it's a 9-month program. A state like West Virginia that I just mentioned, they do it in a variety of ways, and in child care it may be all year, and in Head Start it may be 9 months. In schools it's probably going to be more like 9 or 10 months.
Is it a 7, 8-hour day?
I think it depends, but the research is pretty clear that a full day is better than part day. Obviously, a full day of poor quality is not better than a part day of really good quality. Quality is critically important. So, if a child can get 6 or 7 hours of really good, high quality instruction, and this isn't, I'm not talking about the teacher standing up teaching the child. I'm talking about the teacher setting up a really exciting learning environment. Children come in excited, and then the teacher's there to support his or her learning so that children are really exploring and developing some of their own, directing some of their own learning based on what they're interested in.
What's the annual cost compared to, say, a 6th grade?
Well, unfortunately, early learning, and that's what I was going to comment on arts, on your model here. You got to look at the economics of this. Think about, you have a teacher. Well, I want to back up a little bit. If you have usually pre-K pays is about half of what we get for 1st or 2nd or 3rd grade or for high school. Unfortunately, that we're pretty happy about that because that's so much more than childcare. But if you do the economics, you have 20 children in a class of 4-year-olds, and I don't know, what's a scholarship?
Well, we estimate 10 to 13,000 to get the kind of quality,
13,000.
to get the quality that we need.
How's that compared to 6th grade?
6th grade in Minnesota, it's about $10,000 a year.
So it's about the same as the 6th grader.
A little more.
A little more.
You think about, the teacher-child ratio is it's worse, yeah.
That's lower.
And especially if you start thinking about very early, 0 to 3, where there's a lot of big impacts, then you're talking 4, 5, 6 kids per teacher, and there's no way to do high quality cheaply. There's just no way. It doesn't work. You need a person. Yeah.
I actually have statistics here, but it shows that your pre-K is about $7,592, Head Start's about $7,851, and K-12 is about $14,900. Okay. So there's a differential there. If we had the same funding for early learning that we have for K-12, we would have a high-quality system.
Last question, curriculum for a 3-year-old kid, what's the curriculum?
There's lots of wonderful curriculum out there. You'd be amazed, really, that teachers use, and we can't endorse any specific curriculum, but there's a lot of curriculum. You don't want the teacher, as I said earlier, directing the kids. You want them coaching them and helping them and coming in and directing at times. But this is if you walked in, you'd say, "Oh, these kids are just playing." And then if you had somebody there helping you, you'd see, oh, the teachers, in the Block Center, there's all these books about bridges, and these kids are building these really interesting bridges, and then they're taking pictures of them, and then they're writing stories about them, and then they're maybe going over the internet and doing some research about it. So you're really taking starting where the child is, but then you're encouraging them to move further. So you don't want to get too tied into a curriculum. You want to use a curriculum as a guide, but you don't want to get too tied in that you can't follow the children's lead.
That question comes up all the time. What's the cost? And I think it's the wrong question to be asking. If I tell you, if you're looking to invest in a private company, and they showed you an 18% return, almost risk-free, that doesn't go unfunded very long. Okay? So I think that it's important that the government, as they think about these public investments, they do the cost-benefit analysis. They look at the return on that investment, not just what it's going to cost. If we were to do that in this state, and we looked at You don't want to get me started on stadiums. But if you look at the but if you look at the public return, and take the Mall of America, look at the public return on that. You show me the study where there is any public return to expanding the mall, which they were going to do anyway. They got $250 million. Now, I actually know the backstory. I don't want to go into that. But I think it's very important that we don't just simply ask the cost. We say, is this a good public investment? If it's not, fine. If it is, and we're getting double-digit returns, and the money that I'm talking about, the returns here on health, there's an amazing amount of evidence now coming out of the National Institute of Health and CDC showing your health metrics at the beginning years are highly correlated 40 years later. So we're not even counting that. So the cost, this is cheap to do this. Now, Aaron, I'm going to let you talk about some of your research that on IQ that is very, very persuasive, very poignant on how critical those early years are. And I'm going to disagree a bit with Aaron. I actually think it's cheap to do those sort of interventions given that kind of return.
Well, the way to think about, so my research shows, you asked about age 3 curriculum. It's out there. Dr. Doggett's right. It's out there. Abecedarian preschool has a great curriculum. It's been replicated in other studies, in other settings. I looked at a random assignment experiment that was run in the 80s. High quality, full day, free childcare for kids age 1 to age 3. So age 1 curriculum. And kids from low-income families, treatment, control group, flip a coin. They're just the same kind of kids. Flip a coin. The ones who get access to the center, their IQ scores are the same as higher income families, kids from higher income families, when the program ends at age 3. 2 years later, when the kids are going into kindergarten, they still look much more like kids from higher income families on IQ scores than kids from low income families. It's not something baked in the kid. It's something in the environmental interaction. Go out 5 years, 3rd grade. Their academic achievement, math, reading, IQ, they look more like kids from higher income families than kids from low income families who didn't have these opportunities. Go out 15 years. Nothing special has been going on for 15 years. Age 18, it looks very similar. It looked similar to what it looked like at age 8, at age 5, at age 3. The kids from the low-income family in the treatment group look more like kids from higher-income families in the control group than they do like low-income kids in the control group. So there's curriculum out there. There's strong evidence that it can pay off. And how to think about this rate of return. So Art said 18%. Other people have said other numbers. I'm going to be conservative here. I'm going to say 12% return. And I'm going to put that up against, let's think about the context. So investing in the stock market, private sector investment, that's where our capital is if we're not taxing it and putting it into other public uses. Since World War II, the average rate of return is below 6%, like 5.8%. So this is, say, conservatively double the rate of return. How do you think about that, double? It's not twice as much. Rate of return, it's tricky. So you invest $1 for 50 years at 6%, you end up with $20. You invest it at 12%, you end up with $400. You get 20 times as much at the end, not twice as much. So it's very high payoff. There was a question up there. Anybody? Hands up? Yeah, sir, right there. And then this gentleman in the McAllister shirt, and here in the pink sweater. Thanks.
Project Head Start's been around for a long time with some mixed results. What have we learned from that experience?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Head Start.
Project Head Start.
Oh, Head Start. So I'm going to comment, then let you jump in. So this is my understanding of Head Start. It wasn't created as a child development program. It was established as an anti-poverty program. So early on, Head Start, many hired the parents, trained the parents to be the teachers. And they really weren't responsible for making sure these kids were starting school healthy and ready to learn. They were trying to improve things. I'm not saying they weren't, but they didn't have the accountability to do that. And I believe it was Congress in 1999 changed that, and I think if you look at Head Start after 1999, you'll see a significant difference in quality. But even given that, and this is Janet Curry's research, when she looks at long-term and some of the Head Start cognitive results don't look that good, in terms of social and outcomes, Head Start kids long-term do better in terms of outcomes. So even Head Start, which isn't the top quality programs on average, there's some great Head Starts around, don't get me wrong, but on average, Head Start hasn't performed well on cognitive scores, but they have on outcomes. And so I'm not saying that's the 18% return, but I'm going to tell you, even the 18% return, maybe we're having success with 30, 40% of the kids. We're on a learning curve. We're tracking all this data. We're going to get better as we go on. So, and in our model, our parents can choose Head Start. It's got to be a 3, 4-star rated program, or they can choose Montessori, or they can choose a faith-based or private. We like the competition. We think competition is going to make Head Start better. And a little side story on that, that's one of the reasons I was able to influence Rahm Emanuel way back when they were not happy with Head Start. He realized this kind of program would make Head Start compete. And if it's not a good Head Start and the parents don't go there, that's a way to end the Head Start program if they're not producing. So not surprising, you're going to hear competition as the way to make this sustainable and to get that quality. And we shouldn't just get rid of Head Start just because they're not as much quality as we want. We should get Head Start into that competitive business. And there are many Head Starts out there, by the way, they're terrific. We have one in St. Paul. About a third of our scholarship kids go to that Head Start. So I think as a system, we want competition. And I think that's the way to improve Head Start and improve quality for all parents.
I would say that some of the Head Start programs are some of the best in the country, and then there's some that are only mediocre. And fortunately, we have looked at the research results, and because of that, are trying to put better quality in place. So Art made the point that we now require that 50% of the teachers have a BA degree and have training in early childhood. BA is not everything a teacher needs, but it's a good start. They're also making the programs at the bottom 10% recompete. Unfortunately, there's not enough competition. So sometimes they'll say, you know, this program has got to recompete for their grant, and we're not automatically going to give the money to this program, and there's no one else in the community that will apply for it. But there is a major effort on to improve Head Start through better quality of teachers, through recompeting the ones that aren't doing as well, and as well as really providing that coaching and mentoring for the teachers, which is we haven't talked much about, but that's one of the ways that you really get that quality embedded into the classroom.
Great. Yeah, ma'am. And then,
Libby, I have a question for you. What suggestions do you have, and what lessons have you learned from other states about competing efforts as far as age groups? You know, do we start 3 to 4? Do we start 0 to 3? Do we start with only school programs or community programs? How do we become most successful in getting funding from legislators with those competing efforts?
Well, Nancy, thanks for all your good work on MiniMinds and for kids' dental care. There's no silver bullet, and I think in some ways people think we sold PreK as a silver bullet. There's no silver bullet. Home visiting's not a silver bullet. Even your program is not a silver bullet. Children need quality all along the way. So we need to provide that support early on. When a woman gets pregnant, she needs support right then and there. And there are lots of at-risk moms that if you reach out and you say, you know, there's a home visitor, here's someone who can be a coach and mentor to you, help them get to the doctor, make sure they take their prenatal vitamins, that it really will change that child's life and will change that mother's life. So we need more money for home visiting. Mothers and dads are working nowadays, and the quality of our child care is not all that great. I think it's much better in Minnesota than it certainly is in Texas, but we need to improve the quality of child care, because if you do the economics on that, it won't pay for itself. And parents are in their early earning years, and here they're having to pay $10,000 for a year for childcare, and that's on the cheap end. I mean, it can be much higher than that. So we need high quality childcare, and then we need the schools and others to step up and provide pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, and we need Head Start to be better. If you put all those pieces in place, we'd have a pretty darn good system.
And I have a quick question. I'm part of the MiniMinds campaign with the Minneapolis Foundation. As you recited the data regarding the other initiatives that were successful across the country, I think that there's a real opportunity for us to leverage that here in Minnesota with our own legislators. So I'm hoping that you might be able to share that data with us, in particular maybe even give it to Art, and Art's part of our coalition as well, so that our lobbyists then can leverage that, because we know that we are also a very competitive state for being #1, and if that's what it takes, then that's what we use.
Yeah, when you tell business leaders that where they should look to see high-quality programs, and you say Oklahoma, West Virginia, they're pretty darn Georgia, they're pretty darn astounded.
Sir.
So I sort of have 2 questions, and the first is with the scholarship program where you took the 650 kids, was there any concern, or did you employ any statistical techniques to worry about the selection bias? That is, were the 650 families that stepped forward first simply the more motivated, the more driven, the better parents whose kids were going to have better outcomes anyway?
That's one question. Was that 2? Are you a student of Judy Temple? Do I have that?
No, but Professor Gary Kruger did tell me to say hello to you.
Okay. No, we would have liked to have done a randomized control group. When we first started out, in fact, there was a lot of concern, skepticism. Who are these people? Are they coming to take our children away? I mean, so we had to go door to door, and it ended up being first come, first served, basically, who we could get to. Once the word got out that we're the good guys, not the bad guys, we ran out of money pretty fast. So there was selection bias all over the place, absolutely. What we're trying to do, and the reason I went on the Northside Achievement Zone board is because when I went to the Northside Achievement Zone, this is Sandra Samuels, I said to Sandra, in St. Paul, we know we didn't get the most at risk. I said to her, will the North Side connect us with the most at-risk families? And she says, that's not a problem. That's exactly what they do there. We also have one of our Race to the Top pilots is White Earth. And in White Earth, we may be able to do a lottery up there. Right now, they did first come, first serve. But those kids, I mean, the percentage of Native American kids that graduate high school is so low, I don't think we're going to have to worry too much about selection bias. But it is an issue, clearly, for us. We worry about that. We look for ways to control it. Rick Chase is here, and that's what he does at Wilder for a profession, to worry about selection bias. Absolutely. Having said all that, there's so much research to say we're going to be successful that at this point I would say it's time to invest. We'll get better at this, and we'll learn more as we go along. But my line is we've got too much already independent research to know that we're on the right track.
Sure, and then my other
there is
question.
a second question.
Second
You can
question,
tell
tell me.
he didn't give up the mic yet.
Oh,
No, I did not
That's the tip.
forfeit the mic.
So 2 questions
2 questions.
is the
So,
max.
The second one is, how exactly are the public returns measured? So, of course, these programs are going to lead these kids to probably have higher wages as they grow up, but then there's also probably a lower probability of being arrested and committing crime and ending up in jail, which is, of course, a great public return.
Right.
But is the increase in wages considered public when you calculate return on investment? So, what is the public return?
So
and
you've
where is
sort of touched on the major one is reduction in crime. That clearly, but we show, this is going on in Pennsylvania, and they're doing social impact bonds there, and what they're finding is, and I'm going to make these numbers up, but rough idea, say it's 6 out of the 10 kids born in poverty end up needing special ed. When they go through high quality early childhood education, it's down to 1 or 2. I mean, there's a dramatic decline. So right away, there's a public savings in less need for special ed. We're showing fewer kids are retained when they go through these programs. That's another big savings. And as you start moving up the line, so if they stay off welfare, that is a public savings. And of course, the reduction in crime is major public savings. You could argue that, and I used to teach inner city Detroit, if all these kids would come in and they were engaged, and they had parents that were engaged, I was a better teacher. So productivity of teachers are going to go up, which is going to benefit all kids. You argue that's another public benefit. Not always easy to capture the public goods aspect of it, but I think in this case we can do a pretty good job. And that's what Rob and I did when we looked at this data. We did try to take a conservative approach to it because it's hard to measure. But let's take the low end, and even at the low end, we got these very high returns.
Sir.
So I think I'm up. So if I'm understanding, when you talk about the market approach, you're talking about you give the dollars to the family, and we'll leave the sorts out for a second.
Kurt, we actually don't give dollars. They get a letter, congratulations, and we list the 3, 4-star programs that you can choose from.
Okay, so, but the choice is coming from the families, right?
That's right.
Okay, now, going to the funding side, that's not a market-based approach, that's public funding.
That's right.
Okay, so now, there's kind of 2 questions here, I guess. One, but I'll say them both. The
Thank
first
you.
one is, what mechanism from a public policy perspective can you pursue to avoid stadiums versus public early childhood education? And then the second is, well, I'm using stadiums as a shorthand, by the way, other competing needs. And then the second is there anything creative you can do in tax policy to encourage private supplying of funds?
So the Kids versus Stadium, we've marketed this as economic development, and we're going after economic development dollars because most of those many dollars that cities and states use in the name of job creation is luring businesses from other cities and states. So from a national perspective, it's a zero return. You're just moving them around. And the New York Times reporter by the name of Louis Story a couple years ago actually got the data that I never had, county by county around the country, and she came up with a conservative estimate that cities and states spend about $90 billion a year trying to lure each other's businesses. Zero return. So one place to go for funding is economic development dollars, but that's going to have to be done at the national level. They're going to have to end the economic bidding war. And that gets into a whole other issue, but there is money out there. States could obviously choose to do that. It's hard. I mean, you're the governor of this state. You don't want to lose the Vikings. You don't want to lose the Twins. You know, if they went after 3M or General Mills, it's a difficult situation, okay, politically. Incentives. You know, economists love incentives. We now have incentives to improve quality. So to improve your rating, if your rating goes from 1-star to 2-star, there's an incentive for that, and then incentive builds as you get to a 3 or 4-star. As far as private matching goes, you know, it's interesting, at least in this state, and we have a very progressive business community, we've had no trouble, as I said, raising $20 million to help fund scholarships and mentors. And I think if the state came forward with an endowed fund, I think we can get a significant amount of private money to fully fund the endowment. I think the business community, especially the successful businesses, they're here for the long run. They know to attract good people. They need good schools. They need low crime. They need a good workforce. They get it. So I don't think it's a problem incenting them to invest in high-quality early education. This is one of the, I'm usually not a big fan of public-private partnerships. This is one that works. This is one that really has this public goods aspect to it. And I think because it's long-term, I think you need that. You need the private sector, you need the business community to step forward because the political system, as you know, tends to look 2-4 years out. It's difficult to get them to look 20 years out, but the business community does.
So does that mean potential for tax incentives for businesses too?
It could. There are people that have looked at that. I haven't. I don't know.
I think they've tried that some in Louisiana.
A little bit.
Is it,
Hi, as someone who's working currently as a public school teacher in the Minneapolis public schools, I can attest to what we like to call the complexity of serving students in poverty and diverse classes. But what I'd like to ask is, I'm totally convinced by the numbers, right? But
this is Aaron's wife.
That's my wife, my lovely wife, Kathy. Give her a hand, everybody.
So I have to say I'm convinced by the numbers. But still, what I'd like is if any of you would be able to paint a picture of how a classroom would look different if we were really investing in early childhood education. How would the elementary classroom look if we did a better job with our students in poverty and weren't trying to play catch up in the elementary classrooms?
Well, I think you can actually see this in some states because they are doing a pretty good job of providing this high quality early learning. So you have fewer children in special education. So, you know, ask any teacher, children in special ed, and I'm a special educator, I love those kids, but they can create more challenges. So if you have 1 instead of 3, or 1 instead of 2, that makes a huge difference. You get the children at the bottom who come in, and I taught first grade, they already know their letters, their letter sounds, they know how to write their name, they know where they're going to have a cubby, they know to sit down. There's a lot less getting children oriented to school because they've already been doing this before. So you have fewer children in special ed. You have children, everybody seems to know the ropes, so you can get into the content a lot faster. And then you have children who were normally, you know, really lagging behind, who seem to get it. You're going to still have a wide spread. I mean, I don't think, you know, we don't want to, I think one of the problems is we're not doing a good enough job keeping those kids at the top, you know, challenge. We're still going right there for the middle. But, you know, maybe you can differentiate a little bit more your instruction so that you can meet the needs of the children. I think you'd have more parents engaged. Parents wanting to come volunteer, but parents also making sure the homework's done because you got them in early. So I think it really can make a difference. I think it is making a difference. It's, you know, we haven't done a randomized control trial to look at how it's different in first, second, and third grade. We've looked later on. One thing we didn't talk enough about is that even if the cognitive, the research on cognitive skills, I'm glad to hear yours, it's great. But generally, it doesn't show that IQ is maintained. But what it does show is that later on in junior high and high school, the executive functioning, that means the self-control, the motivation of the children, is there with a vengeance. So those children are more likely to finish high school and go on and get a 2-year, 4-year degree. That in and of itself is a huge savings. And that's, you know, that social emotional development, that executive functioning is as important or maybe even more important than that cognitive development.
And that James Heckman's work in that area, that's exactly what Heckman concludes. But if you want to observe what it would look like, get on a plane, go to New York, go to Harlem, and Jeffrey Kennett, the Harlem Children's Zone, he's got a charter school there, and there was no self-selection there. There was no selection bias. He really went after the most at-risk. And you go into his second or third grade class, and you think you're in Edina.
Great, thank you, ma'am here, and then sir and sir. Thanks.
So I almost hesitate to go back to the how do we pay for it question after that kind of inspiring answer, but one question, just 2 parts. Art, you talked about the land trust and an endowed fund, and if that's really a viable option, could you just take a little bit to, you know, you and I have talked about this a lot, but to educate us a little bit more, and if it's such a great option, why hasn't it been done, and what are the barriers? And then the second part of that, about how we pay for it, when I think about social impact bonds, I think about investing in something that may be a little untested, maybe a little bit risky, a little bit innovative, and I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing that the research is unequivocal. So why would we go a route of social impact bonds when we're talking about a known commodity?
Well, Laura, as you know, I'm not a big fan of the social impact bonds. The Mall of America isn't required to show a social public return on $250 million, but we are, you know. So that's right. But I'm glad you asked about the School Land Trust Fund. So Minnesota becomes a state in 1858. Shortly after that, the federal government gives the state of Minnesota, and this is true of other states, a bunch of land. And the proceeds from the land have to be used for education, okay? So the value of that fund today is something like $700 million. And the idea is we would rewrite the codicil. We may need a constitutional amendment to do this. I'm not sure yet. But we rewrite the codicil. Again, it has to be used for education. So it is there. It is permanent. But to rewrite the codicil so it can only be used for early childhood, starting prenatal to 5, scholarships plus mentors. And then I've got some commitment from the private sector that if the state came up with an endowed fund of $700 million plus, we do a 3 or 5 year campaign, just like the university does for buildings, for physical capital. We'd do it for human capital and go out and raise maybe another $300 million. And then I'd call Libby and say, now we need about $500 million from the federal government. And now, I remember telling this to Governor Pawlenty, you don't have to raise taxes. Get $1.5 billion, and now you've got enough, big enough endowed funds so you could finance poverty and below, all children with scholarships and mentors. Now, there is a little bit of a loss. It generates, it's not managed that well, that fund, but it generates about 30 million for K through 12. But we're going to argue that we're going to save enough in special ed so K through 12 really won't lose a dime. So that was one way, and I like that way because once it's permanent, now I can get people like KinderCare. They've made a commitment to me that anywhere in the country we get a permanent fund for scholarships, and it's permanent. They will open a high-quality early KinderCare program for at-risk kids, and they claim they're the best. I said, whatever. This is Mike Milken. I said, whatever, Mike, happy to do it, but we don't have that yet. But I think with that kind of fund, that kind of permanent fund, we can get the market to work very well. We can get the infrastructure response. It'll be a big incentive if we know. People say to me, well, wait a minute, this has never been tried before. I said, hold on. Go out to the western suburbs where I live in Plymouth. There's a bunch of high-quality early ed programs. Parents have all kinds of choices there. No government came and told them to do that. But these parents have money and they have information. So we want to give those same tools to our poverty families so they have money, they have an effect, economic power and information. And the market, if it's a permanent fund, it'll work. So that's the School Land Trust Fund. We've got some legislators interested in introducing a bill. Now that we have the governor in his State of the State address, many of you may know, has made a commitment that by 2018, every one of our vulnerable kids will have access to high quality early ed. This is a way to do it. And I think we got some momentum. There was some talk a number of years ago of using that School Land Trust Fund for early ed. So that's been talked about. I think we got now the momentum, and with Libby on our side, we're going to do it. Literally, thank you.
To follow on some of this, I think the policy is clear, economics are clear. Implementation is a critical part. And as I think about this, we want multipliers. And so the question is, what are the outstanding programs for teaching the teachers as a way to get a multiplier?
Aaron said it's a good question. Go, Aaron.
So look, thank you, Kathy. I mean, you guys are asking questions that are on the frontier of research. They're really good questions. The question about how do you balance opportunities to invest very early, prenatal, 0 to 3, 3 to 5, how does that complement our K-12 investments, our higher ed investments, our adult labor market, investments? What's the right path of investment? Like, just give me a budget, and how should I spread those investments out? No, honestly, I mean, people might tell you things, but no one really knows. It's what we know is that we have pieces of things that work in a given context, in the context that we see them. We have the ability, I'm working on questions like this with Juan Chaparro right here, right now, and I don't know, there's a lot of people working on these questions, Heckman, Flavio Cunha, and the questions about workforce development and how to get the best people trained into the best classrooms. This is something K-12 struggles with tremendously. It's the frontier of policy there, and it's a can of worms that we're trying to open up. But
there are a couple of things you could do. One is, in early childhood, we frequently like to have a ladder so that people who are in child care who don't have a degree can go from teaching in child care and get a 2-year degree, and then maybe a couple of years later can go get a 4-year degree. So in most states, and I imagine Minnesota's like this, I talked to some people about it today and they didn't deny it, you go to a 2-year college, a community college, you get a 2-year degree in early childhood. And then a couple of years later, you take your degree into the university, one of the wonderful universities here, and they say, oh, we'll take 9 of those credits, we'll take 15 of those credits, but we won't take those others. And so that person's 2-year degree is not as helpful. They have, instead of having 2 years left, they have maybe 3 years. So our taxpayer money that supports the 2-year colleges and the 4-year colleges and maybe the student tuition, some of the student tuition, and that person's time is wasted. And these colleges have not figured this out. And it's just plainly, they've got to figure out, what can you take at a 2-year college that will transfer? I mean, if these are all state-supported institutions, why don't the credits at one transfer to the other? We've got to figure this out. So that's one thing you can do. The other is we do know that coaching and mentoring makes a huge difference. We all have seen great teachers, and they come to life when all of a sudden they realize, I don't have to get up there in front of the kids and teach them this way and try to keep them controlled, that I can set up this way, another way, and put a computer in here and have some blocks and have these learning centers. You provide that coaching and mentoring, you will get good results. So those are 2 things you can put in place right now.
Over here, Jim, hold on. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry.
Background and then a question.
Another friend.
Dr. Rolnick was referring to the Trust for Public Land, which is now about $1 billion in size. It's invested half in stocks and half in bonds by the State Board of Investment. It benefits from the royalties from minerals, and the state is the recipient of an increasing royalty per ton on an increasing number of tons, so the growth of the Trust for Public Land is going to be there. The question then gets to be, what about how we put all the parts of the puzzle together? We know that we have a growing interest in having young people understand what it is to be a parent. We know that there are people who would like to have young people grow up knowing more about what they will do when it's their turn to become a parent. We know that we have programs like Reach Out and Read. We know that we have Baby Space. We know that we have programs such as Carolyn Smallwood's Way to Grow that reach into the neighborhoods. We know that if we can get them up to the 6th grade, there's Project Success. If we can move them on, there's College Possible. We have the programs. The question gets to be the one that all of us are thinking about here today. How do we get more people involved? How do we have a greater interest on the part of the foundation and the private sector? Both foundations and private sector parts are in place. We have a growing number of foundations who are interested in pre-K. I have the fun of serving on one of them, the Grotto Foundation. We have a major emphasis in this direction, along with an increasing number of other foundations. The totality of it is the important question I want to put before all of us and the 3 of you today. How do we get a culture in this state and throughout the country where people want to do this? We don't get into arguments over this is more important than that. We instead say what counts is for every child to have a life. What will it take for the totality of all of our sectors to come together and realize that the future depends upon the answer to that question?
Great question.
We're all turning to someone else.
Well, that's an easy one, yeah.
You start out.
Actually, being in this building with Hubert Humphrey's picture there, and being in Minnesota for a Texan is quite exciting, because your state has always been on the forefront of really doing the right thing by your families. And so it's pretty stunning when I look at the NEAR Yearbook, which is the National Institute for Early Education Research, and you're 40th in terms of access for 4-year-olds. I mean, it's just stunning to me. And I think, you have a lot of making up to do, because you've for the last 10 years, when other states were just racing ahead, you all, got a little bit later start. I think the approach you're taking is very creative and very exciting. It's risky, because you're going to have to improve every single slot out there. Every single center is going to have to be improved because you have children all over. Other states have said, okay, we can't improve everyone. We've tried to improve childcare. We're going to do it for some, but we're not going to do it for all. But you're going to be improving every single center. It may take longer. But it's pretty exciting. So, I'd say you need to get the word out that you haven't been leading in this area because you are a competitive state and a state that is expected to lead in this area, and let people know that, you're kind of stunned, but then also take advantage of kind of leaping over where other states have been and move ahead more quickly.
Yeah, Malcolm, obviously we need more voices like yours, but MiniMinds' whole approach is to reach that goal and to reach it by getting into the political system and making this issue, as I said earlier, this is pretty invisible in a lot of ways. Most of us don't see these problems, or they don't develop for till 20 years, and then we want to deal with them by building more prisons or whatever. And so it's a challenge to make this as concrete as we can and as visible as we can. And so, again, I think the Race to the Top money, so that we can do this in all different communities with different races, different religions, to show the parents are parents anywhere. Empower these parents, and we can get these results. In my view of that, we got to market better. And it's going to take, again, a lot of leadership. And I think in this state, we've got the business community behind us. That gives me a lot of confidence we can make this work.
And I'll just say, personally, Mayor Betsy Hodges here in Minneapolis has really staked this out as her ground, and she's leaning hard on this. I think a lot of initiatives are coming from the cities, and she recruited Art and I to serve on her Cradle to K cabinet because she really takes this research seriously, and she really wants to make it happen on the ground. And it takes political leadership to stand up, and it takes political coalitions to stand behind and support those leaders. And we have scholars here at the U who study these things. We have a civic community that pushes behind them, and it's our time to move forward. So I saw one last hand, and it's a hand we've already seen, but Jim, close us out. Last question.
Is this on?
Make it a good one, Jim.
Yeah.
Can you, Art, I just want to make sure that Art is giving the market a fair shake. Because you're talking about costs a lot and how much it's going to cost us to do all this stuff. And you're also saying you've seen lots of productivity gains in these organizations. So my question is, are you taking that into account when you're calculating your costs? So if you're really serious about it, these costs should be, if depending on the number you use, that's going to affect your costs. So I encourage you to put that into your calculations if you haven't.
Yeah, you're ahead of us on that, Jim.
Okay, well.
We're starting to see the productivity gains, but we don't have that data yet.
Yeah.
You're ahead of us. And we will definitely come to your office and get you to work on this.
But that's going to be a huge thing, possibly.
Yes, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right, well, thank you. So to close us out, we've heard today about the research, we've heard about the policy. I think for me, it pays to bear in mind and keep in mind the situation of parents of young children. I have 2 young girls myself, and it is amazing to me how much attention and resources it requires to take care of young children. I mean, this might not be news to all of you, but it is to some. And again, we know parents have to save, they have to borrow. We know public policy has to kick in and help parents pay for college. But think about that. It's 4 years. You're middle-aged. You've been working. You're way off in your career. You've saved. You've had all these subsidies. When you're a parent of a young child, you're poor. You're young. You're early in your career, and you have to do it for 5 years. You have to have somebody stay out of the labor market. That costs, $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year. You have to have pay for one person to watch 4 kids, if you're going to do it right. There's no way to do that well and cheaply. They don't go together. So I think we need a lot more policy. We spend a lot of money on K-12. I'm not saying too much. We spend a lot of money on higher ed. Here's a big opportunity. This is where we can really get good returns.